Hello there. I wanted to upload another, hopefully shortish one tonight because I've been kind of frustrated at my uploading pace. Save for the conversation that I had with Paul and Seif today. It was very, it was still messy and the audio sort of messed up, so it sort of sounds like mostly Paul and I are saying not nearly as much as what we're actually saying, and I feel kind of bad because listening back to it, it seemed I was kind of overbearing throughout that whole discussion, just out of enthusiasm, really. It's all happening in good faith. But that being said, I enjoyed the conversation tremendously. I'm sure the others did too. We did touch upon some things, but unfortunately, parts of this discussion are just being... I think it's a problem. I should have used more bandwidth. I think there's an option of how much bandwidth you want to use. Probably could have been more clever about that, but oh well. All of that being the way it is, I have my script here, so I'm going to begin. The previous video touched on the issue of how one ought to consider pre-civilized life in light of the classical distinction between nature and convention, which we spoke about at length. We turned to the origin of mankind, or at least the classics did, because they assumed the axiom of the identity of the ancestral and the good, which carried on to that of the natural and the good, the natural preceding the conventional and hence being the superior point of reference. Of course, if one does not hold nature to be good per se, then one could see convention as a kind of emancipation, protection, whatever you want to call it, from the so-called state of nature, which of course sounds very modern and all that, which causes the latter to lose at least part of its relevance. Obviously, if... I'll explain why later. So the initial change in the natural right conversation was not in terms of a view of history, but of nature, not the idea that plurality in history showed an absence of norms, but rather that human nature reveals no human order to begin with. Strauss explained previously that the former really bases itself on a more comprehensive view that contains the latter. And I think the chapter where that was discussed at length was this chapter about Max Weber, so that would be chapter 2. Going into, reason and revelation and the intelligibility and therefore the what would you say, the rationality of values and so on. Really the part of that video, the previous video that we lost the most time on, is the apparent connection between the interest in nature and Strauss's no doubt esoteric schematic identification of original imperfection with philosophy and original perfection with revelation, respectively. I showed in the first place that such identifications do not simply apply. And that was a complicated and messy argument, but in short, a philosopher could argue either for or against natural right, assuming either the image of the noble savage or the human wolf, and the biblical position in favor of political idealism or natural right, but that isn't quite the right word because revealed law is positive law, so I'll say political idealism here is because the way he worded it is that if man was originally perfect, then there would be no excuse for current imperfection. So that's really what I mean by sort of very strong political idealism. But that doesn't emerge simply from the original perfection of man or some what would you say, some teaching regarding the original human beings, original man, all of which I spoke about at length. Albeit confusingly. But then what is the connection between human nature and human origins? To just go a little bit over merely summarizing. I think it's a connection that emerges from a certain interest, obviously, in nature as distinct from human organization. But it could also well be, one might say, that any kind of organization reveals some part of human nature, which is a dangerous idea in that it could lead to the contemporary notion of culture that Leo Strauss himself seems to oppose. I mean, it's sort of a Petersonian thing. It's like, orders culture, and that emerges from this obviously from this evolution, but from this human way of organizing things. And so, in that sense, every culture would. I mean, Oh, this is a very interesting topic, but I'm not going to go too public with this because I had a conversation with a certain someone about a very densely esoteric essay of Leo Strauss's, and I mean, aren't they all, but about liberal education, and there he sort of goes into the contemporary notion of culture as sort of defining, in a broad sense, basically any pattern of human behavior is culture. And so you see how that connects with this dangerous idea that I'm positing here about how any form of organization reveals at least a part of human nature. So perhaps more carefully expressed, one could say that the good society expresses the natural human capacity for wisdom and virtue, or other virtues, and the bad ones our natural arrogance and susceptibility to mob behavior. I think that would be a more reasonable and, in fact, biblically pious way of stating that. So Strauss, meanwhile, goes into the standard conventionalist argument, starting with this part of the chapter now, namely that plurality disqualifies objectivity. The standard version of this argument, says Strauss, is grossly insufficient and must hence be augmented by inspection of deeper discourse by its advocates. So let's do that, I guess. The variety of ideas about justice, it's very late, when viewed with the assumption that natural right exists and human nature requires justice. I'm assuming that note means, though it does apparently not have readily available, which is to say natural right, knowledge of justice, could allow one to consider these different opinions according to some form of common sense. And of course that would be, in the words of a certain person on my Facebook feed, this is something I could not get over. This person said that, this was in a slightly different context, but the word of like a white modernism really like stuck to my palate there. And certainly my claim to be able to play the arbiter is totally invalidated by my skin color, environment, and respective interests. But then I would say the rebuttal itself, being a white postmodernism born of guilt and despair over the failure of modernism. So let's maybe reset that imaginary argument. So let's perhaps, if common sense is out of the question, then let's say that the fact is that when one acts as if the plurality disqualifies objectivity, one implicitly rejects all the ideas different societies have had. So why not look for after all, why not look for the ideal regime in history? You're basically saying that because they're different, they're all wrong. So one should hence account for why they are each not of value to someone seeking the ideal regime, or in fact the intelligibility or possibility of the ideal regime, and unfortunately take for granted one's capacity for reasoning, whatever biases may hamper it. You're still doing that when you're saying that you can't reason. You're still making some big metaphysical whoopie-whoop statement, so you might as well just keep common sense and be an ignorant white guy, as I said in my conversation with Paul and Steve before. And obviously this is something that Leo Strauss said, not the white guy stuff, but the idea that, why reject all of the different regimes in history outright when all you really have is the fact that they differ. So if the ideal regime is the goal, then one's own regime is by no means exempt from criticism. Of course, we don't have to be wide and ignorant, or wide and ignorant. I made that joke before. The guy I discussed that essay with, all of this follows from what has been discussed in previous chapters. I said that just now. Get to know that former self taking those notes was also on that train of thought. It's good when those thoughts are still somewhat in synchronicity. But anyway, Strauss describes a different imaginary argument, starting other than the white modernism one, starting from the criticism based on cultural bias. So say that two civilizations might agree as to what is justice or what is a good regime or whatever. This could be due to mechanical or mutual influences. They might be in the same circumstances, or they might have been in touch with each other to such an extent that it is in their interest to agree with each other or whatever. Interesting to say interest and how that would reflect on some sort of idealism, but say that all civilizations agree in rudimentary terms. What do these civilizations as such share in common? To say that civilization is preceded by recognition of natural right is a state of tautology. To say that civilization requires sophistication would be met with mockery, says Strauss, because the most refined men today argue for relativism. Strauss speaks of this seriously, but perhaps he's doing that with a kind of impish seriousness, because I personally fail to see the logic of that. It seems to me more like an insult of these liberal elites saying with their relativism and looking down on the little guy who still wants to have this or that regime in his throne and altar nonsense. But it's a somewhat different version, I suppose, of that imaginary argument that I had of saying, well, how do you, you're using all of these terms and making all of these assumptions, but how would that play out practically? Namely, how do you find commonality in even going about defining natural right? But Strauss also picks up on the issue of reasoning, as I did. So the critics of natural right presuppose that the knowledge people need to live justly is as available to them as the things that we perceive with our senses. If they were such, we would surely have seen them. We have not, and hence they are not real. But if knowledge of natural right were more like scientific knowledge, the conceivable existence of natural right would be preserved even if no one had come even close to observing it. The cultivation of reason argument. And this is fair enough, but what is a little contextual thing for Strauss is essentially the slogan for the last vestige of white guy, ignorant modernism today, people such as the New Atheists. Or I suppose, in fact, Jordan Peterson is that, this is something I said about him before, very harsh painting of his essential thesis, but it's that, God is knowing the rules. So we can have all of this, we can get all of this back once we science hard enough. I know I'm very mean about it, but that's basically the whole idea of that, what I call the neo-modernists, or the still modernists. Joke I made in the stream is here's how Kant and the founding fathers can still win the election. But okay, this is fair enough. But so again, this is a big thing actually today. You get approached at platonically and saying, we all hold a little piece, and if we talk, then maybe something will happen. But Strauss. It's funny that I should bring up Plato, because Strauss makes a reference to Republic. No cessation of evil would be possible before such a discovery, namely the discovery of morality or something. And that's quite a sharp line for two reasons. One, it kind of suggests this weird doctrinarianist thing that started in modernism, if I'm using that term correctly, by which I mean fusing theory with practice. That's what I mean by doctrinarianism. I've seen it defined as adherence to theory without due mindfulness of practical ramification. I'm using it in this sense. And of course, neither can be attributed to Strauss, which is to say the doctrinarianism and the harsh dismissal of revelation. If I brought that up, I already forgot. But one should, of course, not take that line out of context. It's scare-quoted, after all, and it is a reference to the Republic. So that in itself holds a kind of, he's bringing in a little voice, a voice within a voice within a voice, because Plato isn't 100% serious about that either, it seems. But Strauss makes a nice observation. Things as thoroughly conventional as money, for instance, can differ from place to place without really causing perplexity. However, natural except if you're in a world economy, I suppose. The natural right obviously falls into a totally different category. Again, if you're in a globalized society, then that is going to also cause similar massive perplexity. But Strauss takes this perplexity as an indication that we've stumbled upon something that's not yet totally in our grasp. And that sounds like something critics could easily wipe off the table. It's very profound and mysterious. It's a little Socratic, it's a little erotic, and hence interesting. That thought might be it's not concretely scientific enough or whatever. So maybe a more concrete observation I would suggest is perhaps the fact that there is a significant opinion that becomes universal exactly due to the pluralism. Namely, everyone says that their own laws are just, or maybe this is Strauss talking. Don't want to take all the credit. Ergo, the assumption seems to be that justice is found in law, that the just is the legal. So this is a universal assumption that points at something natural. As established before, even the scientific reductionist has to agree, even the relativist has to agree to some extent, namely that this is a part of culture. This is a part of justice, and a part of human behavior. So the observation will soon follow that the legal and the just cannot be consistently held to be equal, and hence the focal point of this discussion could be allowed, again, mystically, mysteriously, could be allowed to move a little further towards natural right. And so there's some footnotes here, namely the Republic 340a 7-8 and Aristotle's Ethics 1129b 12. I've summarized them here, but I will start reading footnotes after this, because I thought that would be fun. Plato says that, Thrasymachus says that justice is without exception, very important, whatever the self-serving ruling class says it is. He has this insistence because of his, the Straussian reading goes into this cool thing where it's like he's a rhetorician, so he represents the city, and the city represents the arts, so he has this steadfast faith in the arts, and of course he is teaching an art, namely the art of cheating and of rhetoric, so he has to really trust that what he says is true, but obviously his notion does not hold true if one considers the mistaken judgment of rulers, or at least the possibility for a mistaken judgment of rulers vis-a-vis advantage. And Aristotle says that since it is clear that he who is a lawbreaker is not just and he who lawful is, it is clear that lawful things are somehow just. And then unjustness gets discussed according to distributive metrics. Interestingly enough, I'm not too familiar with Aristotle, but that's how he does it here. It basically to the effect of not taking more good and not taking less of the bad than others or than is proper, whatever proper would be. But so the discussion then has to turn to law. We're on that track now. And law is on the one hand the measure of goodness in a civilization, but on the other hand appears far from infallible. To quote Socrates in the Apology, who knows the laws? Which is to say, who is the legislator? Can we trust our lawmakers to be more wise than we are? To go a little off track here, I listened to the Andrew Klavan show today. He had a very funny intro. Basically, the guy cracked himself up, which is the first time I ever heard him actually lose it over his own writing. It sounds like me, honestly. But half of these videos is like me chuckling at no one. But can we trust our lawmakers to be more wise? There is this trust and expertise, and that's something I actually do go into in this chapter, I think. Actually, it's the next note. What do you know? In this age, more than ever, we are dealing with the phenomenon of the prestige of experts. All of our laws are to be based on unquestionable observations about the arrangement of matter. So that's economics, climate science, etc. Gender, bip, bob, whatever. Yet the greatest appeal for any legislative proposal comes in the end from the rhetorical I use rhetoric in a certain way. That term, maybe I've clarified that before, but it comes from the rhetorical insistence on imperatives outside of legislature or even science. Although it's a little mixed, but that's rhetoric. That's rhetoric for you. It's basically whatever is emotionally effective. Or effective, I suppose. For the ancients, it seems that the relationship between the good and the legal was a matter of needful and careful discussion, whereas for us these days, it's, I mean, on the one hand, again, there's this rhetorical thing is that we have to do it because it is more we as human beings, but then we as human beings as a sort of a sciencey thing because we're all the same, so we have to treat each other the same, and so the people have to come into our country, and all that thing. I mean, I don't want to take a radical position on that or anything, but I'm just explaining the way that the rhetoric works. But then on the other hand, there's this: if it's permitted, then it's good. And both the left and the right have that issue, to some extent. So yeah. Anyway, we've sort of lost that carefulness that they had in a lot of respects, not just this one. But the claim of the law on goodness is its service of the common good. So if justice and the common good are in fact the same, then law has a reference point, which is the common good. That is to say, a stable reference point for each community, seeing as what is needful is not the same everywhere. And this remains sort of a thing. I read an article about Straussian foreign policy a while ago, and I was sort of struck by the inevitability of what follows from this whole train of thought that we're on now is that, at this point in the natural right conversation, in this chapter, we have to, maybe if the just and the common good are the same, then justice is going to differ from place to place. And of course, in the Republic, you have the just city, but the city is only, let's say, it owes its justice to its organization within its own containment, but not in its relationship to other cities. And that is something that we have our quote-unquote biblical baggage. That's not the way I think about it, but we obviously want to have a little wider scope in our justice than that. So the common good, anyway, in that scheme is something that is to be determined by statesmen who have to consider all the relevant factors and do what is good for their own community. So the way in which conventionalism counters is of course with a denial of the common good. We've foreshadowed this plenty of times before. The thing that the laws protect, that which is called the common good, is in fact not common to anyone except the regime and their interest group. For instance, the majority vote in a democracy, and in the case of any regime, the ruling class themselves. So that sort of argument operates according to the assumption that the city is in itself not a natural unit, hence the different parts of a city do not benefit equally from its total health. I mean, it's sort of somewhat like saying, imagine if I had a smaller guy on my shoulder, and I tell him to pay for my cheeseburger because it's better for us. It's like, hold on, I can't digest that. You're going to digest that. I'm not. I just listen to you because I'm standing on your shoulder and you're larger than me. But anyway, so why would the city be unnatural? For the sake, let's entertain that question for a moment. Strauss states a principle that natural things exist without violence. It's not very difficult to come up with a disqualifier for that claim, depending on what sort of assumptions you have. But from this axiom, however, one would proceed to deny that the city is in fact a natural being. In the Republic, you don't have the idea of the city, so that casts some serious doubt on the so-called ideal regime to begin with. But yet this city requires violence, or at least coercion, and what kind of animal needs to do these things in order to live? actually a number of different animals do. Bees and ants, for instance, live in complex social hierarchies. And how could a social hierarchy be unnatural for a human being? I have an answer to that, namely, again with reference to a republic here, as well as, of course, primarily to the Torah, but the deciding question is the existence of the soul, which is exactly in line with all of these references to Plato that I keep making. You'd almost think I was a philosopher or something. But Strauss suggests that there is an essential commonality between governments and slavers because of the coercion, while the latter do seem to be more obviously unnatural than governments. Because, again, we can accept the idea that it is very quintessentially human to organize in some way, whereas slavery is a certain, let's say, a certain exertion of force and a certain denial of the potentiality of a human being. And that remark goes with a footnote referring to Aristotle. Aristotle's Politics, which I don't own, but bringing up Aristotle when it comes to the nature of slavery is hardly a subtle tell, as if to say, unless there is such a thing as a natural slave, or rather, it goes entirely against a human's grain to be treated as a slave, but for a lingering natural slavishness in man that allows him to both live in a city and even make severe sacrifices to it. So the discussion then turns to offspring, or not necessarily following from that, but from the way in which a city is natural. It turns to offspring, and this is important. Also today, a son is not necessarily a citizen. There is an issue of legitimacy and legal approval. I am vaguely reminded here of Socrates' mineral myth from the Republic. Keeps coming back to the Republic. Obviously, Strauss was a tremendous Plato scholar, so perhaps his familiarity with the Republic, for instance, I really did think his lectures on that were absolutely fantastic. Positively mysterious. I do think that Plato was a profound influence on him. But in short, the common good shared between these people is not entirely natural for them. Is not an entirely natural front for them to unite under. After all, two people may not have much in common between them, much less a common good when one becomes a citizen and the other a slave. Or whatever form of non-citizenry. Obviously, you can go straight to you-know-who, Germany, but that's a very sore point for the idea of the natural status of peoples. At least from if you're in the iron box of modernism, so to speak. But the case for justice becomes one of pragmatism, by which I mean if you exclude the possibility of, let's say, root souls, which is an idea that I've been very interested in as of late. But the case for justice becomes one of pragmatism and not realism. Justice is what works for the community. The good is knowing the rules. So except robbers, who also have common interests and respective pragmatic rules, and that also comes straight from the Republic. So you've got governments and slavers, and you've got governments and robbers. This is starting to sound like the Rational Rise or something. But Aristotle may be called upon to say that really the city is better than the gang of robbers, because the city is the context in which human beings can live comfortably, independently, or with a common view to independence, or however that little weirdo puts it, and with the ability to philosophize. And note here, who's ever heard of a philosopher highwayman? Very profound musings. But so the contention of conventionalism is not really that right is something totally arbitrary per se, but rather that its nature precludes it from being something universal and therefore consistently applicable. So yeah, you could have, knowing the rules and what works and whatever, but that doesn't mean that it's natural, right? It doesn't necessarily have that metaphysical status, although, it has a different kind of metaphysic than the classical sense of it. But that's pretty much it for this one. It's half an hour. Oh, great. Yeah, that seems to be about the pace. Every 3 or 4 pages is half an hour. Wow. But okay, so that's it. The live stream is on YouTube. It's my previous video, actually. And there might be another one coming soon. I hope there will be. Well, I hope you guys will have a good evening. And when's the next video coming? Maybe tomorrow, because I have the chapter finished. So maybe next video tomorrow. We'll see. Cheers.